Hi everyone, let's talk about Köhler's 17th Etude from the Opus 89 group. I'm going to start discussing a warm-up that you might want to do this week. I'm starting in measure 40 just before the recapitulation, and I'm going to start on the E major arpeggio section. You could start with some long tones E to B, because if you look at the eighth notes, that's what those would reduce to. Then I would add in the rest of the notes, but holding the eighth notes. So by doing this warm-up, you're working on keeping your air speed constant through that low E and the low B, and then continuing the melodic connection between the lowest note of every group and a middle note that's repeated throughout the group. So that will stabilize your pitch, but also help stabilize your airstream, which will help you play all of the notes more quickly. You could also try some articulations. I would suggest slurring the last two of each group into the following sextuplet, like this. Two spots that I found a little tricky were measure 12 and measure 57. And I came up with a couple methods to make this easier for me. One of them was I played the entire sextuplet and inserted a little break where I could switch my fingers to the next sextuplet. Another thing I tried was putting the metronome on eighth notes and then playing the cross rhythm by leaving out the second note of every two-note group. One last thing you could try with these two measures would be to play them as if they were in 3/4. But I really want to stress that you want to keep that cross rhythm in your head as you're doing that. And speaking of cross rhythms, there's another one in measure 3 and measure 29 that are sort of parallel spots. With these sections, I did the same sort of thing. It reminds me a lot of when you're playing works by J.S. Bach, where you have a melodic motion and you're accompanying yourself with a sustained note. So in this spot, I played. I feel like there are a lot of hemiolas through this piece, not only within the beats, but within the way the patterns are grouped. For example, if you look at measure 3 and 4, they sort of form groups of 2 quarter notes at a time over the bar line. So it kind of helps to know consciously that that is going on. Measure 11 gives me a great chance to talk about something a little bit gross, and that has to do with pinky sliding. So when we slide with our pinky, one trick is to very subtly scratch the side of your nose. Even if you've just washed your face, you'll have a little bit of oil that you can use to slide between E flat and D flat. In measure 23, I decided to reduce beat 2 to 2 eighth notes so that I could practice my subito dynamics. Another idea you could do here would be to insert a rest, like we talked about for one of the previous etudes. So you could insert a little break so that you could practice resetting your mouth without breathing. That way you can sing through those 2 middle notes and then gradually insert the beats back in, either one at a time or both at once. The last thing I wanted to talk about is alternate fingerings. And in this group today, I'm including B flat thumb, even though that's one of our standards. B flat thumb use in this particular etude is pretty problematic. So I decided to really minimize the spots. You want to choose a spot where you're not sliding back and forth because that changes the balance of the flute. That causes tension other places. So you want to try to plan places where your thumb is already up, where you can switch to B natural or B flat back and forth. I also wanted to talk about other alternate fingerings. Alternate fingerings can be sort of problematic sometimes. They're very personal, first of all. They have a lot to do with your physical setup, the way that you're playing your flute. It has to do with the flute itself. Maybe sometimes things leak a little bit, or your flute places things just in a slightly different way. And a lot of times we have more than one option. For example, high F sharp. We all know you could play this way, or you could play with middle finger. So that in mind, there are some tricky fingering passages that in the long term are easier to do with alternates, but in the short term are very frustrating. So it will have to be up to you, and it is always up to you when to choose these fingerings or not. Some things that we can do is we can add fingers through a passage and compromise a few of the notes, but depending on the musical context we're in, that might be totally fine. For example, I'm thinking about things like the opening noodles to Daphnis and Chloe. A lot of us have some alternate fingerings that we use through that passage because in the full orchestra, our section is not going to be obvious. In a case like this, when you're playing by yourself, you definitely want to listen carefully and see if the fingerings you're adding are altering the pitches so that they're either really out of tune or just have kind of a bad sound to them. Starting in measure 15, a couple things you could do. You could play this passage, the entire measure, by adding your right hand 1 like this. You can see I did not move that entire time. My flute the C has a little bit of a weird sound, but in the context, I think it'll work out okay. Another one, you could continue in the next measure. You could also experiment slowly and see probably okay in the next measure to also keep your right hand first finger down that entire passage. For the B flat diminished in measure 17, you could even add right hand 1 and 2. And that makes it easier to hold, but at a cost because you have to become comfortable with a different fingerings. The very last beat of that measure, you could even add 3 fingers. So in general, D flat, you can add your whole right hand, and in some cases it benefits. It makes a little bit of a darker sound. It helps with the pitch a little. So that's one thing that you can keep in your toolbox to pull out. And then measure 18 to 19 have a little bit of similarity. In the first one, I decided that my high C sounded a little strange with the entire hand down, but you could either do or in other words, just leaving 2 and 3 on through that passage. And then measure 19, same idea. You could add right hand 1 at minimum. So that's what I think about all of these possibilities. If you want to have these tools in your toolbox, then give it a go, because that's what etudes are for. I hope this helps.